Well, welcome back. I will be continuing on with our series, Communism, the Dethroning of God. This is be part number 2. This is again, to reiterate, a 4-part series. Section 1 was talking about theoretical Marxism by education, the theory, the doctrine, the ideology. Most times in the conversation of communism, is always mostly compared to capitalism, but it's normally seen as merely an economic system alone. I contend that it is a tyrannical or a totalitarian ideology that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. I'm taking a look at communism from a biblical worldview. And so the first part was theoretical Marxism. Section number 2 will be military Marxism, how it is carried out. So let's get started. So section 2, military Marxism by force. Let's look at the communist revolution. Here, let's get some quotes from Karl Marx from our earlier study. You can refer to section number 1, which we talked about the theoretical aspects of it. Karl Marx says, of course, in the beginning, this cannot be effected except by means of despotic inroads on the rights of property. Another one of his quotes, this is the larger or a portion of the larger quote. Remember, we talked about how the famous quote, workers of the world unite. Well, part of that quote, he says, referring to the communists, he said, their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. That is how communism is implemented. Let's take a look at the communist revolution. Let's look at the first player in the communist revolution, Vladimir Lenin. November 7th, or also October 25th, according to the Russian calendar, what is known as Red October. So 1917, Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik overthrow the Russian government and establish a communist dictatorship. There's old Vladimir right there. Let's learn a little bit about Vladimir. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov was born in Simbirsk on the Volga River on April 22nd, 1870, into a well-educated family. He was the third of 6 siblings and would go on to become first in his class in high school. Lenin was one of the leading political figures and revolutionary thinkers of the 20th century, who masterminded the Bolshevik takeover of power in Russia in 1917 and was the architect of the first head of the USSR. The Bolsheviks were, of course, the party. Let's delve a little bit into his background and some of his early days also. When he was 17 years old, he was expelled from Kazan Imperial University, where he was studying law, for taking part in an illegal student protest. So obviously we see he has the revolutionary spirit at a young age. After his expulsion, Lenin immersed himself in radical political literature, including the writings of German philosopher and socialist Karl Marx, author of Das Kapital. So we see the thread that leads through all of these movements. What they have in common is communism. So Lenin started studying Marx at an early age, which shaped his worldview. Like many of his contemporaries, he was arrested and exiled to Siberia. He emerged as a prominent figure in the international revolutionary movement and became the leader of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democrat Workers' Party. Lenin returned home and started working against the provisional government that had overthrown the Tsarist regime. He eventually led what was soon to be known as the October Revolution, but was effectively a coup d'etat. Also notice the language there, because in our day, we hear a lot about a social democrat. Someone will say, well, I'm not a communist, I'm a social democrat. Well, we're going to see as we go through the language that the terms are synonymous. Communism and social democrat are synonymous with one another in the way that the early communists used it. Almost 3 years of civil war followed. The Bolsheviks were victorious and assumed total control of the country. During this period of revolution, war, and famine, Lenin demonstrated a chilling disregard for the sufferings of his fellow countrymen and mercilessly crushed any opposition. Although Lenin was ruthless, he was also pragmatic. When his efforts to transform the Russian economy to a socialist model stalled, he introduced the new economic policy, where a measure of private enterprise was again permitted, a policy that continued for several years after his death. So again, we see this common theme of communism. When it's implemented, it never works. We saw it in its early stages when we learned about theoretical communism. We talked about Marx was not the inventor of communism. There were many communist societies throughout Europe, and there was one individual by the name of Robert Owen who implemented it throughout Europe. And then he even came to the United States and tried to implement a communist socialist society. And within 2 years, it failed. Well, even in the early days of Lenin, the communist model failed. And so he introduced a new economic policy where he allowed a measure of private enterprise. Now let's look at the next individual, the next player, as we progress through this militaristic ideal of communism, how communism is implemented. Let's look at Joseph Stalin. Born Iosif, I'm going to try to say it very slow, or you can just read it on your own. You can see there, it's his name. He was born on December 21st, 1879 in Gori, Georgia. So he's not even a Russia, he was born in Georgia, which was then part of the Russian Empire. Georgia is an area just north of Turkey in that region. After his father left, Stalin excelled academically and in 1894 graduated first in his class from the elementary clerical school in the city of Gori. It is reported that his father was very abusive. His father was an alcoholic. He abused Stalin. He abused Stalin's mother, and very oppressive individual. And after he abandoned Stalin at the age of 9, then that's when his personality seemed to flourish a little bit, and he came out very bright student. We're going to see a common thread also with these communist revolutionaries. They're very bright individuals. Karl Marx was a very well-read man. He was a philosopher. He was a thinker. We see Joseph Stalin. As we mentioned, Lenin was born in a middle-class family, and he was very gifted in his schooling. Then also Stalin himself, he was awarded a scholarship to the Tiflis Theological Seminary, a Russian Orthodox institute. He attended seminary not because of any aspirations of becoming a priest, although his mother wanted him to do so, but because it was one of the few educational opportunities available in Georgia. In seminary, and get this point, this is where Stalin was exposed to the Marxism. So in seminary, Stalin joined a Georgian social democrat organization, and there began his devotion to Marxism and the socialist movement, an affiliation that resulted in his expulsion from the seminary in 1899. And then also consequently in 1913, as a young man, he formally renounced his given name and took the surname Stalin, which means man of steel in Russian. So that's where we get the name Joseph Stalin, man of steel, and it certainly reflected his character. During the Russian Civil War between 1918 and 1922 conflict, which the Communist Red Army defeated the anti-communist White Army, and also the Polish-Soviet War in those years, Stalin was an officer of the Red Army. The Red Army was so named because of the bloodshed to again establish the working class fight against capitalism. In a famous statement, Stalin claimed that the closer the country came to achieving communism, the more intense the resistance by the revolution's enemies would be. In order to force the new socialist society, he ruthlessly enforced the repression of socially alien elements and then enemies within the revolution itself. The refusal of the state to tolerate even indifference to its aims gave rise to a new term, totalitarianism, to describe a regime whose efforts to control its population reach far beyond the repressive measures of even the most despotic tyrannies and dictatorships of the past. Stalin gave voice to the repressive mentality when he stated, "Ideals are more powerful than guns. We would not let our enemies have guns. Why should we let them have ideals?" This sounds eerily similar to much of the talk that goes on in the 21st century on media and many politicians when we're talking about gun control, limiting gun control. Well, Stalin mentioned that ideals are more powerful than guns. And he was saying, we didn't let our enemies have guns, neither should we let our enemies have ideals. And we see that in our day also. If that's not concerning to you, I don't know what is. As of 1922, Russia was the poorest nation in Europe. Lenin died in 1924 after a series of debilitating strokes. Before his death, he wrote a letter to the Bolsheviks urging them not to allow Stalin to rule in his place. So as we mentioned earlier, Lenin was a pretty harsh individual himself, but he also had a little compassion toward his people. But Stalin, not so much. He saw Stalin's character, and he wrote a letter to the Bolsheviks urging them not to allow Stalin to take over once Lenin passed on. This is a excerpt of that letter. "Comrade Stalin, having become Secretary General, has unlimited authority concentrated in his hands, and I am not sure whether he will always be capable of using that authority with sufficient caution. Stalin is too rude, and this defect, although quite tolerable in our midst and in dealing amongst us communists, becomes intolerable in a Secretary General. This is why I suggest the comrades think about a way of removing Stalin from that post and appointing another man in his stead, who in all other respects differs from Comrade Stalin in having only one advantage, namely that of being more tolerant, more loyal, more polite, and more considerate to the comrades, less capricious, etc." Because Vladimir Lenin, he favored Trotsky. He wanted Trotsky to take over once Lenin passed on, but Stalin had other plans. After Lenin's death, Stalin ruled as the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union and Premier of the Soviet Union from 1929 to 1953. That's a long reign of terror. As we mentioned, Lenin died of, he had 3 strokes, and his 3rd stroke was his demise. He died in 1924, and then in those convenient years, Trotsky was very instrumental in the revolution. And then, but by the time that Stalin worked his way in 1929, he exiled Trotsky. And then several years after Trotsky's exile, I think Trotsky was exiled to Mexico. And then I think it's like 10 or 14 years after his exile to Mexico, then Stalin had Trotsky executed. A nice fella, this Stalin was. And of course, Stalin reigned from 1929 to 1953 over what was known as the Soviet, or the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic of UR. So that's the USSR. Notice again that the communist socialist relationship is so close that it's indistinguishable the way they use it in their time. It's just us nowadays, we sort of make a distinction, and we make it seem like socialism is not as bad as communism. In the final analysis, a principle, this part, if we're talking about the Great Terror, because as Stalin began his reign, it was brutal, but then he took it out initially on the kulaks which were the kulaks were the private farmers. He confiscated their farms and put them into concentration camps known as the gulags. He took their farms away from them and made them government farms. And then he forced other Russian individuals to work on those farms. And so that happened over a period of years. But then that terror even progressed to what was called the Great Terror. The Bible talks about evil men and seducers waxing waxing worse and worse. And so we see that there was no end to his evil and his oppression. But let's talk about the Great Terror for a second. In the final analysis, a principal objective of the Great Terror was to establish a civil and military bureaucracy composed of young cadres raised to blindly, unquestioningly, and zealously follow Stalin's orders. That's what he wanted to do, because he came to power with using or exiling Trotsky, and then he also had 3 other comrades, communist comrades, who he came to power with. But then, sorry, he got rid of them, and then also he started to eliminate those who helped him come to power, and he grew a group of young individuals who would not question him, who would be blindly devoted to him, and they were very impulsive and would follow him unquestionably. A second goal was to eliminate all socially dangerous elements, a category of people whose numbers were constantly growing. Stalin was always talking about his enemies and those who were threatening his regime from within and from without. In this latest wave of terror, known as the Great Terror, Soviet authorities sought to finally achieve the complete liquidation of the clergy. And I want to talk about this aspect because, remember, as I'm talking about this, I'm not examining communism from a purely economic standpoint. I'm examining it from an evil ideology that exalts itself against the knowledge of God. It is a worldview that motivates individuals. It's a religion. They even use that language when they were formulating the Communist Manifesto. Initially, they wanted to refer to it as a catechism or a confession of faith, but they thought, well, we better not do that. That sounds a little too religious. But that's what it is. And their target is the abolition of religion. And so this is the part I want to talk about what they did. Once they were firmly established, then they sought the complete liquidation of the clergy, a mission they had begun in the late 1920s. Thousands of priests and nearly all bishops were sent to forced labor camps, but most were simply executed. Of the nearly 21,000 churches and mosques that were active in 1936, fewer than 1,000, pardon me, excuse me, fewer than 1,000 would still be functioning as early as 1941. The number of officially registered clerics nationwide declined from over 24,000 in 1936 to a mere 5,665 by 1941. Among the measures for which Stalin is best remembered was his widespread use of slave labor camps, or otherwise known as gulags. Gulag, or gulag. A gulag is an acronym for Glavno Upravlenie Lager. I'm sure I didn't say that right, but that's what it's an acronym for, which in Russian just means main camp administration. So he had these gulags set up all over. Some of the things that Stalin did in this Great Terror: he sought to entirely liquidate the clergy. He sought to nationalize all aspects of Russian industry and commerce via disastrous collectivization policies that ravaged the countryside's economy. But all he was doing was implementing Marx, because as Marx talks about, nationalizing everything being in the hands of the government. Well, we see that this is what Marxism looks like when it is carried out. He intentionally engineered famine in Ukraine during 1932 and through 33, resulting in the deaths of an estimated 10 million people. Just unbelievable. So again, 10 million people perishing at the hands of Stalin, even more so than that. But these are in his developing days. He expelled hundreds of thousands of Communist Party members, the very individuals who helped him rise to power. He eliminated them as well. During the Great Terror of 1936 through 39, millions were imprisoned, enslaved, deported, or executed. The death toll during this period was approximately 700,000, or in other words, 20,000 per month, were perishing all in the name of Marxism. He conducted massive purge of the Red Army. Remember what we looked at earlier? At one time, he was a general of the Red Army. This man has no loyalty at all. So he conducted massive purge of the Red Army, resulting in the execution, imprisonment, or dismissal of more than 35,000 officers. He deported millions to forced labor camps, or gulags, where inhumane conditions prevailed. These camps swelled both in size and number throughout the 1930s, providing Stalin with manpower he needed for the massive construction projects in various regions of the USSR. Whereas in 1929, there had been approximately 55,000 prisoners in these gulags, by 1935, their number stood at 965,000. That was composed of 725,000 in work camps and over 240,000 in work colonies. In the second half of the 1930s, the Gulag population doubled from 965,000 in early 1935 to almost 2 million by 1941. From 1934 to 1941, some 7 million people entered Gulag camps and colonies. At least 300,000 are known to have died in the camps from 34 to 40. Over the entire course of the war, at least 2 million perished in these camps. All told, the death toll in the gulags was about 2.7 million. Almost 3 million people perished, all in the name of Marxism, because Marxism is only implemented, as Marx told us, by force. In 1951 or 1950, Stalin encouraged North Korea's communist ruler Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of our dear leader in Korea now, Kim Jong-un. This is his grandfather. Well, Stalin convinced him to invade South Korea and unify the country as a single communist state, pledging to support the North's military effort. But Stalin did not expect the United States to come to the aid of South Korea, which it did. As a result, the North Korean attempt to overrun the South ended unsuccessfully after 3 years and the loss of some 3 million lives. So the body count continues to go up, all in the name of Marxism. In February 1953, Stalin began laying the groundwork for a new terror campaign against Soviet Jews. So he already waged a militaristic war on his own people. And so now he's turning his aim toward the Soviet Jews and ordering the construction of 4 enormous prison camps in Kazakhstan, Siberia, and the Arctic North. But he did not live long enough to turn this dream into a reality. On March 1st of that year, he collapsed at his country home outside of Moscow, and he died 4 days later of what was determined to be a cerebral hemorrhage. Being a dictator, I imagine, has a lot of stress on you. Not only do you put stress on people and those who you terrorize, but obviously you put a lot of stress on yourself also. We saw that Vladimir Lenin had a series of 3 strokes. The last one took him out. And then we also see that Stalin also died of a cerebral hemorrhage, which is also a stroke, what we refer to as a stroke. Let's look at his legacy a little bit. His admirers, now again, notice that word, his admirers. Now, who in the world could admire Stalin, except I'm sure his mother? It doesn't matter how evil an individual becomes. Mama always loves. It's always mama's baby, no matter how much destruction they cause. But who could admire him? We saw what he did with the kulaks, the farmers. The farmers initially he wiped them out, made them slaves. We saw what he did with the dissidents, people who disagree with him. We saw how he treated those who helped him come to power. We saw how he treated Trotsky, and we saw how he treated the Red Army. These were supposed to be his comrades, his allies, and look at how he treated them. So it amazes me how he has any admirers at all. But guess what? He had admirers. and I'm going to tell you who some of those admirers were. They lavished titles on him, such as Father of Nations, Brilliant Genius of Humanity, Great Architect of Communism, and the Gardener of Human Happiness. Well, doesn't that sound precious? The Gardener of Human Happiness. And of course, he's also referred to as Uncle Joe. He was the subject of much literature, poetry, music, art, and film. While such high honors paid to so horrific a historical figure may strike some readers as remarkable, Stalin was also worshipped by the international left. Those were his admirers. The left, the other Marxists, his sympathizers, because we talked about how all throughout Europe there were pockets of socialist communist communities, which gave rise to Marx and Engels, so that they can write their communist manifesto, so that they can put their belief systems on paper and in a body of work. Well, these communities all throughout Europe, they were his admirers. They spoke well of him. And then also not just the international community, but also in America. America progressives, in universities, in newspapers. Stalin made Time Magazine Man of the Year for 2 years. So that ought to let you know again how strange that is. This was the same left that eventually would support Mao Zedong in China, the communists in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Central America, Fidel Castro in Cuba, and the Khomeini Revolution in Iran. Leftists, it's an ideological kinship. They agreed with his ideology. Never mind all of the millions of people who lost their lives in his rise to power. He was admired by the left all throughout the world. It's amazing how when he and Hitler made their agreement in 1941, and then Hitler broke that agreement, that treaty, that pact. Hitler broke that treaty and he attacked Russia. And then, of course, Russia turned around and retaliated. Well, everyone looks at Hitler and views him as the most evil man in the world. And I agree with Hitler being an evil man. He was an evil man. He did evil deeds. But how is it that Hitler is widely known as being evil, but somehow praise is lavished on Stalin? Stalin is not viewed in the same evil light that Hitler was in. And they're two individuals. There were two madmen, totalitarian dictators who wanted to rule the world, and they wanted to enforce their views on one another. There's no difference in the two men, but somehow the left, his fellow communists, have raised Stalin up to praiseworthy status. So we talked about Karl Marx, and we talked about Lenin, and we talked about Stalin. So these individuals gave rise to communism. So let's look at the rise of communism. Marxist theory gave rise to Lenin and Stalin's forceful imposition of tyrannical rule. Lenin and Stalin's maniacal march for utopia gave rise to many brutal communist dictators. Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, Pol Pot. Let's look at the profiles of some of these individuals. Mao Zedong was the leader of the Chinese Communist Party from 1935 until his death in 1976. Folks, that's not very long ago. Chairman Mao, as he's referred to by the Western left, is arguably the greatest mass murderer in history, eclipsing even the murderous Joseph Stalin in this regard. Some 70 million Chinese, along with countless Tibetans, Mongolians, Manchus, Koreans, Hmongs, Uyghurs, and other nationalities perished at the hands during his long and brutal reign. Here we are, militaristic Marxism implemented by force. There's good old Mao right there in his, I call a malware, a little pun on what he has. There's a certain individual also in our country in politics. She seems to always dress in that fashion. I like to call it malware. Many of you, I'm sure, will know who she is. Every time you see her, she has malware on. I wonder what that's all about. Anyway, the second fellow we'll look at, Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruiz, which Hollywood seems to have a romantic affair with Fidel Castro. Let's look at old Fidel. He was the third of 6 children. Fidel Alejandro Castro Ruz was born on August 13, 1926, in Cuba's eastern province of Oriente. His father, Angel, was a wealthy sugar plantation owner originally from Spain. Stop. What is this all about? What is this commonality that many of these men who were infatuated with communism, they all come from wealthy backgrounds. They all come from the elite backgrounds. Their parents were, Karl Marx's father was a lawyer, was a successful lawyer. Friedrich Engels' father was a industrialist. He was wealthy. Engels and Marx lived off of that money. And we see many of them come from high standards, high class, and they were very intelligent. Well, Fidel Castro also, true to form, his father was a wealthy sugar plantation owner. Fidel was raised and influenced while surrounded by poverty. Somehow maybe they're guilty of their parents' success. And so therefore they feel like they have to do something to distance themselves from that. It sort of reminds me of a funny story of a Bill Cosby. I digress a little bit, of a Bill Cosby episode. We know the Huxtables were wealthy. Huxtable, the dad was a physician, and Claire was an attorney, and so they had a nice lifestyle, and they had 5 children. And then one episode they were talking about, I think it was his what's the son's name? Anyway, I can't think of it right now. The son was ashamed, talking about he didn't like being rich. He was going to school. He just wanted to be a normal person. And so Bill Cosby, the father, tells him, son, you're not rich. Me and your mom are rich, but you're not rich. Well, that's what it seems like these individuals. They weren't rich. Their parents were rich, but somehow they benefited from their parents' wealth, and they get somewhere twisted up into their head, but they gravitate toward communism. Capitalism is what caused the wealth of their parents, but somehow, for some reason, they themselves gravitate toward communism. Anyway, going back, he was raised in affluence while surrounded by poverty. Fidel Castro was educated in private Jesuit boarding schools. He attended El Colegio de Berlin, I'm sure I botched that, and he pitched for the school's baseball team. He was a pitcher of baseball. How bad could he be? You know, baseball, hot dogs, and apple pie. He's a good guy, right? After graduating in 1945, Castro entered law school at the University of Havana and immersed himself in the political climate of Cuban nationalism, anti-imperialism, and ta-da, socialism, because it's an ideology. Let's look at the next individual, Pol Pot. Who is this guy? Pol Pot was born Salath Sar in what is now the province of Kampong Thong, Cambodia, in 1925. He came from a prosperous farming family that in 1931 moved to the capital, Phnom Penh, where the young Pol Pot learned some of the rudiments of Buddhism and was subsequently educated in a series of French language schools. In 1946, he joined Ho Chi Minh's Indo-Chinese Communist Party. There's a connection. And 3 years later, was awarded a scholarship to study radio engineering in Paris. So again, it's not an uneducated individual. Smart fella, come from a good family, prosperous farming family. Pol Pot was a leader of the Khmer Rouge, the Communist Party that ruled Cambodia from 1975 to 79. Khmer Rouge, in other words, it means Khmer Reds. This was the French rendering of the organization's official name. The Communist Party of Cambodia, later the Party of Democratic Kampuchea, also known as Communist Party of Kampuchea. It's the KP party or CKP party. Pol Pot was the leader of the Khmer Rouge, the brutal communist organization that ruled in Cambodia from 1975 to 79, only 4 years. but a lot of damage was done in 4 years. Was strongly influenced by the French Communist Party. He turned Cambodia into a massive gulag of slave labor, was responsible for the deaths of some 2 million people. You think of that, 2 million, 4-year reign of terror, 2 million people. He was responsible for poverty, starvation, and terror were the hallmarks of Cambodia during his rule. And let me remind you all again, 1975 and 1979 is not that long ago. I graduated high school in 1979. Let's look at the next individual. Ho Chi Minh. Look what his name means, bringer of light. I think he pretty proud of himself, thinks a lot of himself. Ho Chi Minh was born, I'm not even going to try to say that, on May 19, 1890, in a village of central Vietnam, which is part of, again, French Indonesia, or French Indochina. Ho Chi Minh first emerged as an outspoken voice for Vietnamese independence while living as a young man in France during World War I. Inspired by the ding ding, here's a clue, Bolshevik Revolution, he joined the Communist Party and traveled to the Soviet Union. He helped found the Indo-Chinese Communist Party in 1930 and the League for the Independence of Vietnam, or Viet Minh, in 1941. So he was a true believer. Let's look at the communist body count, because we talked about how the only way that communism came to power is by force. And let's look at, there's a website that talks about the communist body count. And from 149,469,610. And then this information just tells about the website and how they came about compiling this information. But let's look at the People's Republic of China under Mao from 1949 to the present. 73,237,000 perished in the name of Marxism. Then the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic, starting at Lenin all the way through Stalin. And to, again, these figures were compiled up to 1991. 58,627,000 people perished in the name of Marxism. Then let's look at the Russian Soviet Federation of Socialist Republics. This is just under Lenin alone. Under Lenin, it was 3 million, over 3 million perished at the hands of, in the name of Marxism. The Democratic People's Republic of North Korea, from 1948 to the present, over 3 million people perished in the name of Marxism. Over 2.5 million of them just were starved to death just between the time of 1995 to 1998. Cambodia, as we mentioned, which started off with Pol Pot, almost 3 million perished in the name of Marxism. The People's Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, this spreads throughout Africa here. 1.3 million people perished from 1974 to 1991. The Republic of Cuba, 73,000. That's compiled from 1961 to the present. So we see here, communism is not a pretty thing. It's never carried out voluntarily. It's never enforced voluntarily. The leaders and the founders of communism tell us that much. And so we end our discussion of military Marxism there. And so then part number 3, we will, section 3, we'll talk about cultural Marxism. And this is implemented by deception. So we want to stop right there. Our next discussion will be section 3, cultural Marxism, Marxism by deception.